Karl Barth is one of the most famous 20th century theologians. Was on a streetcar one day in Basel, Switzerland, where he lived and lectured, and a tourist was there in the city, climbed onto the streetcar and sat down next to Karl Barth. And the two men started chatting about each other's lives, and Barth asked if the man was new to the city, and he said, indeed, he's a visitor. And so Barth said, is there anything that you'd really like to see while you're in the city? And the man said, well, yes, he said, I'd love to meet the famous theologian Karl Barth. Do you know him? And Barth replied with a smile, well, as a matter of fact, I do. I give him a shave every morning. The tourist got off the streetcar, delighted, returned to his hotel, saying to himself, I have met the man who gives a shave to Karl Barth every morning. I've met his barber. Oh, it's an amusing story, but it's a story that kind of points to what happens in the Easter story so often, and too often in our own lives, is right in the presence of God's simple graces, we have the inability to recognize them. The tourist was there with the presence of the very person he most wanted to meet, oblivious to all the clues that were being dropped. The man never realized that he was actually speaking to Karl Barth. I think that's Mary's reaction as we've read through these stories of the resurrection appearances on that first Easter morning in her grief. Remember John's Gospel? She believes that he's the gardener until he speaks her name, and it's in the speaking of her name that the recognition comes that it's the risen Christ. And then, of course, the story this morning in Luke's Gospel of the Emmaus Road account. Later that same day, when Mary had encountered Jesus in the morning, the disciples are walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, which is about 7 miles away, and they're having an extended conversation with each other about all that has taken place. Now, what's fascinating to me is that the gospel writers tell us these resurrection appearances in their own way. They turn the story in lots of different ways. They're jumbled reports, if you will, and nobody goes back to try to straighten them all out so that they make sense. There's not one collection where, well, this is the definitive story. It's almost like if we all had an experience together and then each of us wrote about it from our own perspectives and how different it would be. Some of the facts the same, some separate. We would mention different people in different ways, or we would just exclude people altogether because it doesn't seem important to them in the story. For some people, that just lends authenticity to the story. These aren't crafted works of fiction. These are jumbled reports of eyewitness accounts of the appearance and encounter and the recognition of the risen Savior. In Luke's account, the story of the first Easter says that the women took spices to the tomb to anoint the body, and when they got there, the stone was rolled away and the body was gone. 2 angels said to them, why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, he's risen. And they return from the tomb and they go tell the disciples all that stuff. But in Luke's Gospels, the disciples say that they don't believe him. The word is laros, which says, we politely interpret it as we don't believe it. It's a crock is really what it means instead. So they really didn't believe it. Because their words seemed like nonsense to the disciples. So, except for the testimony of the women, on Easter morning, nothing has really been resolved as these men, for whatever reason, leave the city of Jerusalem and they go to Emmaus. And that's why this story is important, because it helps us to talk about recognizing Jesus. Evidently, the 2 men who were on their way didn't also believe the story of the women, because that's what they report to the stranger who joins them. We just don't find this story very credible. They were talking about what had happened. We don't know precisely what they were talking about or who these disciples were, although one is named Cleopas, but we don't seem to know exactly who Cleopas is. Some speculation is that the other is Luke, although at the end of the story we have the story of the other disciples, the 11, gathered together. Perhaps this is Luke and Cleopas, and he's too humble to even mention himself. We don't know why they're headed to Emmaus on that first day of the week. You can conjecture all kinds of things. Maybe it was their disappointment with all that had taken place. One of the saddest lines in all of Scripture is in here, but we had hoped And you can almost hear the crashing down of their hopes around that phrase. They are disappointed that this Messiah that they had been following for 3 years has now ended up in a tomb, and their hopes are as good as dead as well, shattered, lying in the tomb with him. We don't know exactly why they're going. What we do know is that as they walked and talked, someone came up alongside of them and began to have a conversation with them, and it says that they were kept from recognizing him. I think that's interesting. They had been followers of the Master, but now he's walking along with them, speaking with them, and they cannot recognize him. Maybe as with Mary, it's sort of a natural explanation that the grief and disappointment has gotten in the way, and so she can't see. You lose hope, you discard your dreams, you're blinded by good things that surround you, but all you can see is the difficulty. Have you ever been there? Pastor and author Leith Anderson, as a boy, grew up outside of New York City, and he was an avid Dodger fan, Brooklyn Dodger fan. Loved the Dodgers. One day, his father, dream upon dream, took him to the World Series game between the Dodgers and the Yankees. Now, Anderson was so excited, he was so sure that the Dodgers were going to trounce the Yankees that he could hardly contain himself. Unfortunately, that day, the Dodgers didn't even get on base. His hopes were dashed. This young child with this excitement now just shattered, lying around him. Years later, he's engrossed in conversation with a man that he described as a walking baseball almanac, and Leith was telling him about attending the World Series game, and he said, "Oh, it was such a disappointment. I mean, I was a Dodgers fan, and the Dodgers never got on base." To which this walking almanac said, "You were there? You were at the game when Don Larson pitched the first perfect game in any World Series ever?" Yeah. Leith said, "Yeah, but we lost." He then realized that he was so caught up in his team's defeat that he couldn't see the history-making event that was unfolding right in front of him. He writes about the event. "I wonder how often the same thing happens to us. We get caught up in the defeats in our lives, the times when things don't go our way, the way we wanted them to. We're so depressed because an illness continues to linger, or when people we don't treat us the way we think they ought to, or when we face financial difficulties. But we're often blinded by the pain and disappointment of our defeat that we fail to appreciate the fact that we might be witnessing something far greater that God is doing in our lives." I think that's a human thing. I think those are wise words. We shouldn't let our temporary disappointments blind us to the good that God is doing in our life. We also need to have something broken open like those disciples on the road to Emmaus, the breaking open of our own disappointment and failure and difficulties and pains and illnesses that seem to block our vision, our understanding of how God is involved in our life. Don't assume that any of our disappointments, that God can't have a final word on those things as he does with the disciples on the way to Emmaus. We just hope that Jesus doesn't have to address us by saying, "Oh, how foolish you are." And that's how the disciples are taught that. But I think it's difficult, isn't it? If you've ever had hopes dashed to the ground, you know how difficult it is to kind of pick yourself up and realize you've got to move forward when your focus of your vision is in one particular place, and you become blinded by your disappointment. Anybody who's gone through something really difficult knows that's true. Divorce, the death of a loved one, it's hard to see beyond that point, or unemployment, or some kind of professional failure. It's hard to see beyond, I put so much into this, and I can't see forward. The story seems to be saying that it's the Master's deliberate plan to keep them from recognizing, at least in this particular story. I don't think that that's true in our lives. I think more often than not, God's dropping hankies and hints and flashing the lights on us so that we will get the idea of God's divine and perfect and loving presence. But he's preparing them for something. He's preparing them for something. I think it's the most beautiful part of the story, particularly as somebody who loves the Bible so much and loves teaching the Bible so much. And I joke that what a day it will be when Jesus leads a Bible story, but I'm not joking. what a day it will be when Jesus leads the Bible study. And that's what these guys get. Heaven, to me, is going to have Bible study in it, just because I think it's so fascinating. It's such a fascinating book. What really happened in Genesis 6 with the Nephilim? That's just crazy stuff. What is that about? You know, tell me what the backstory of that is. What happened with Peter? You know, tell me why Peter was such a lughead about that. Let Peter speak for himself. But I think it's a beautiful story. That's what Jesus would say. You got to ask him. I think it's a beautiful story how Christ begins to saturate their lives with the story. He gets them to rehearse their story. What things, he says. Are you the only person who's been under a rock for 3 days, they say? I mean, this was a public execution. What things? Yeah, what things? And they begin to lay out their dashed hopes, one after another, after another. And they litanize it all out there. And then Jesus takes the strings of those and begins to tie them back together. And it says, starting with Moses and through the prophets, he begins to reveal to them what it is about the Messiah and how he was to suffer. And he begins to attach those hopes again to the ancient hopes of the prophets, to the dashed hopes of the prophets, and how those hopes were coming true, but through time. And he begins to weave for them a narrative. And did you note what they said about that narrative, about that Bible study? This would be a great goal for any Bible study, I think. How our hearts were ablaze. Have you ever been in a Bible study or a worship experience where how our hearts were ablaze? Oh, I could feel it. Wesley's, our hearts were strangely warmed, you know, that sense of Christ's presence in this. Somehow in the retelling of the story and Jesus grabbing a hold of that narrative and attaching it to the disappointed hopes of the prophets, bringing it forward, they begin to see in new ways. John Calvin said that the Bible is like a pair of eyeglasses. Think about that for a minute. The Bible is a set of eyeglasses. The Bible is not an encyclopedia of knowledge. It doesn't answer all the questions that we ask. With years of studying the Bible, we may never come to a sufficient understanding of the whys of our disappointments and our defeats. That's not what the Bible does. But the Bible allows us to see things in a new light. It may not answer all the questions, but we begin to see in a new way. For those of us of a certain age, when we go to the CVS and pull out those limper glasses, oh, how glorious it is to read the medicine bottle again. That's what the Bible does. It helps us see again in a new and a fresh way the circumstances of our lives. It may never answer the question of why such and such happened, but it can begin to help us to see the steps it will take to move into a new reality, the way in which we see life again. We were broken into overnight. Some of you, how many of you know that? Nobody knows that. It's a big surprise. We were broken into. We had a door smashed in. The story is, oh, it's okay. Everybody's all right. Nobody's hurt. It's all good. The man was high. And he knew there was a 7 a.m. AA meeting. And he just had to get in. Now, you can look at that in a couple ways. Oh my gosh, they broke a window. How much work is it going to be? It's going to be terrible. You can look at the brokenness of this life that is so messed up, that his judgment is so impaired. But I look at it this way. Some beggar knows that there's bread here, that there is hope here, and he will not let anything get in the way of it. Even if his judgment's impaired, he knows, even through that heroin-addicted, judgment-impaired experience, he knows that there's something here that can fill him with something that he cannot drink or drug or shoot up, that will give him hope beyond the day, beyond the next fix. And it's in these doors. I just wish it was the gospel and not AA, but I'll take it. We need to pray for that young man, Robert, who encountered our Robbie early this morning, and it was his undoing. How do we see, folks? How do we see? And can we recognize, even in our disappointments and our defeats, God leading us forward? That's the story of that first Easter evening and the Emmaus Road. You've heard the line that seeing is believing. I've never really been of that. I like that. Oh, I love that. I mean, everybody wants to be able to see and tangibly hold it. But the fact is that most often we believe without seeing. If you drive on the freeway at 70 miles an hour, careening, 5 to 10 feet from another vehicle going the same speed, or in an opposite direction going in equal speed, don't ever think about the possibilities of what seeing is believing is like. You are believing so that you can see your way through that. That's the nature of faith, isn't it? We believe in order to see. That's the glasses that we get in faith, to believe in order to see. Nelson Searcy is an author, and he talks about visiting Disney World. I don't remember this, but I read his take on this. He and his young son some years ago went to Disneyland. It was a magical time for them. What they didn't realize until it was time to leave the park was that the people who had first designed the Disney parks did something quite creative. They hid discrete images of Mickey Mouse throughout the Disney parks and throughout all their attractions. Maybe you know this. The images are simply three connected inner... I did that the wrong way. Sorry, that was me upside down to myself. Trying to make it make sense to you and turned it upside down. Three connected circles. The outline of Mickey's head, his ears, his face. All arranged all through the park. Etched into things. Put into posters. Built into the landscape. And next time you go to Disneyland, look for them. Disneyland is jam-packed with these little hidden Mickeys, Nelson says, but most people don't see them because they don't look for them. Searcy and his son sure didn't, and then they learned during their trip that this was a part of it, and so it became a part of their awareness. And then suddenly, as it was a part of their awareness, they became aware of the overwhelming surrounding presence of all these images of Mickey. They began popping out of the woodwork, some cases, literally. They had been in the park all day. They hadn't seen them until someone told them the story that the Disney parks have etched behind the scenes the image of Mickey absolutely everywhere. And it was only upon having that happen that they were able to see. It's kind of like buying a car, You think it's cool and unique, and then you buy it and everybody else has it. What is that? Is that because suddenly everybody bought it when you didn't? No. It's because you have eyes to see and to recognize. There are some things that must be believed to be seen. So it is with the life of faith. Sometimes something happens, either good or bad. Some people see a mere incident. Perhaps they see a coincidence. Others, however, see God's hand in it. We believe in order to see. It makes a difference whether you are seeing through the eyes of faith or through the eyes of skepticism or disappointment. The amazing thing is how often you can look through the eyes of faith and see the handiwork of God. With those lenses on, we begin to see how incredible God's creation really is. I believe it's no accident that Jesus had these two men on the road to Emmaus recount all the events. Sometimes it's helpful, isn't it? I'll tell people, they'll come and they'll complain about their lives, and then they'll come back and complain the same thing, and they'll say, oh, I'm just going to wear you out, and I don't really want to come and talk to you, Pastor. Or you've had friends who do the same thing, or maybe you've done the same thing I have. But how important it is to exercise that story, isn't it? To get it out. To be able to lay it out so you can see it. And see it for what it is, not for what the internal evaluation of it is. And that's what the wisdom of Jesus is laying it out there. And then he sets them up with this great Bible story. 7 miles, that's kind of a long Bible story, I would imagine. Longer than you guys would usually put up with me. But notice in Luke, in Luke's gospel, where is Jesus? And Luke's gospel is written well after these events. He's recalling them before the death of the disciples. They began to write these stories down. They're evangelistic stories that they're telling, but now it's getting to the place where they need to write them down. And he recalls this one. Look where he turns. He turns to the story of the Bible and the breaking of the bread. Where is he turning? What are we doing this morning? Luke turns us to the church. He says, if you want to encounter Christ, get your glasses on. I know. You look across the aisle and you see the person who didn't put the toilet seat down in the men's room, the person who didn't wash their hands after they went to the bathroom, the person who failed to do their goodie time or wasn't there to usher or let you. You look across, you see those disappointments and the trouble that you bring to each other. As I've often said, if it's just me and God, it's all great. When you guys get involved, it messes it up. I know it's true for you too. What's true for me is true for you. You mess it up. But Luke says, wait a minute. Look back to the church. What do we do? What are we going to do today? It's right there already. We are going to break bread. What did we do already? We read normally, not in Easter season, the law, the prophets, the epistles, and the narrative of recognizing Christ in the world. Get your glasses on, Luke says. He's right here. And if you have your glasses on, you could recognize him. Believe in order to see, he says. And I think that's the value of gathering every week. It's rehearsing our hope. It's laying it out again, complaining. I think that's the point of lament prayers, is laying it out for God so we can see it again, putting our lives out there again so we can see it again, so that Christ can set us up to that moment when, oh, yes, I get it now. I see that you were right here with us all along, but we just couldn't see it. I hope you can see it. Maybe you're a Bible person like I am, and you could see it when the Word is read and you begin to delve into it. It just, for me, it set aflame. I get it. Or maybe you're a communion person, and when you take that bread and wine, that you connect to that unbroken chain of 2,000 years worth of believers, our ancestors in many cases, who have held this bread in their hands and who have put their hope in the words for the forgiveness of sins. That we join with that unbroken strain. Notice that Luke's gospel leads us into Luke's community. He leads us into our community, back into the church, and we're invited to encounter Christ in this place, in broken bread, in the Word, and in the broken lives of those who are around us, who inspire, who trouble, and who challenge us to be his people. Luke's community put on their glasses. We know that because, well, we're here. And in putting on their glasses, they also began to see how in their community, as in ours, their hearts can burn with the love and the presence of Christ, and that in that presence they receive again joy and the peace that the resurrected Christ brought to those first disciples. May that joy and that peace be ours as our eyes are opened to his presence here today. Amen.